Today, we're talking about how to paint fur in watercolor, and we'll look at 4 of my favorite brushes that I use in my paintings. So we'll go over the materials. I'll share tips for painting realistic fur. We've got some practice exercises for you. And as we move through the lesson, I'll talk about those brushes. To practice creating fur, you can use a small piece of watercolor paper. This is Osh 140-pound cold press paper, taped to a piece of cardboard to keep it flat. Feel free to use any size paper that you prefer. For the practice exercises today, we'll be using Winsor & Newton, burnt umber, and a little bit of yellow ochre. Feel free to use any colors, any brand that you prefer. I'd like to demonstrate some different brushes. I want to show you that you can use your favorite brush to do this. And these are my favorites. I'll be using the small Michael Klein pointed round number 2 from Rosemary and Company. The next brush is a Princeton Velvet Touch. That's a slightly larger brush. I'd say it's a medium-sized brush. I'm also demonstrating today how you could use a comber brush or a Filbert grainer with similar brushes, but you can create fur a lot more quickly when you use those brushes. So now we're going to move into a short lesson on how to create fur, techniques for creating realistic fur. And I'd like to share 4 tips that will help you to create nice thin hairs. First, I like to use the consistency of tea, but more often milk. Any thicker than that, and the color sometimes doesn't want to come off the brush. When picking up color from the palette, you want your brush to be clean and just barely damp because you're painting very thin hairs, small lines. And if you have too much color on the brush, the hairs might be too thick. And pick up just a bit of color on the tip of the brush. Finally, to create nice thin hairs, use the very tip of the brush. So the tip of the brush will barely touch the watercolor paper. I'll keep reminding you of these techniques as we move through the practice exercises. And now let's take a look at how you can hone your skills in painting fur. We'll begin with the small brush, and as we move through these exercises, I'll show you how you can use the other brushes. Rinse it and wipe it on the towel to kind of wake it up if you haven't used it yet today. This is burnt umber. This is the consistency of, I think it's like milk. Just a bit of color on the brush. Feel free to use any color. To create thin hairs, you want the tip of the brush to barely touch the paper. And I often do a warm-up like this on a separate piece of watercolor paper. I've got the back of my hand anchored to the table, and I'm moving my fingers to create the fur. And do you see how I'm spacing the hairs apart? I often do that as I apply layers of fur. Now, how much fur can you create before the brush runs out of color? Let's rinse the brush and wipe it on the towel. Now, the brush is barely damp. And we'll pick up a bit more, just a bit of color. If you find that your fur is too thick, it might be that you have too much color on the brush. Anchor your hand to the table. The tip of the brush is barely touching the paper. And as you're practicing like this, experiment with different consistencies. Experiment with how much color do you need to have on the brush? How wet or how dry does the brush need to be? Fill an entire piece of watercolor paper with little hairs. Now, how would it look if we use a slightly thicker consistency? Well, it's going to be darker in value. And I find that when it's a thicker consistency, like thin cream, sometimes it's kind of hard to create nice thin hairs, but give it a try as you practice. Now here's a different brush. This is a slightly larger brush. It's a pointed round brush, and that's what I like to use to create fur. Just a tiny bit of color. I anchored the back of my hand to the table, so the back of my hand is touching the table using the very tip of the brush. And that will help you create nice thin hairs. And with practice, you will get a feel for the brush technique. And when you're using a slightly larger brush, which maybe holds a little more color, you might not need to pick up color as often. Now, I think you should practice curving the fur too, because that's how we create contour. So just go all over your watercolor paper in all different directions. Practice consistency, the amount of color, how wet the brush should be. When you're comfortable creating fur, let's move into an exercise where you can fill a small shape with fur. This is the process I use to create fur in my animal paintings. I'll draw this shape on the paper, and feel free to draw anything. We're going to fill it with fur. This is the consistency of milk. The brush is clean and barely damp. Let's begin by creating fur around the edge of the shape. The tip of the brush is barely touching the paper. And you can turn the painting for an easier reach. I do that with larger paintings too. If you use more of the brush, the fur will be thicker. If you use just the tip of the brush, the fur will be thinner. Now here, maybe my hairs are a little thicker there, and I think my brush was too wet. So if you feel like your hairs are too thick, rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel, and pick up a bit more color. You can lift and smooth color too with your slightly damp brush, like I'm doing here. When you use thin consistencies, it's easy to lift color and make refinements. I went back to my smaller brush. We're going to create more than one layer of fur. So this is the first layer. Anchor the back of the hand to the table. And I'm curving the fur to create the impression of contour. Keep going until the brush begins to run out of color. Then pick up a bit more and continue. Do you see how I'm spacing the fur apart so you can still see the white of the paper in between the hairs? Now here I'm curving the fur in a different direction. The curving of the fur helps to create contour. And I've got a little speck of something there. I'm going to take care of that in a moment. See that little speck? I rinse the brush, wipe it on the towel, and you can just lift it out just like that. If you feel like it's appearing too rough, the fur is too rough, dip your brush in water. Now the brush is slightly damp here. And you see how you can smooth and kind of mingle the fur, but yet you can still see the fur. When this is completely dry, apply another layer of fur, picking up a bit of color, consistency of milk. Then I'm going to create some different values here. So I'm laying in what I'd like to be a darker value in the upper part of the shape. And the way to do that is you place the applications closer together, then moving away to become lighter in value, you start to space the hairs apart. So here, I'm using a hair-like motion, but I'm placing the color close together. And I'm becoming lighter in value as I move away from the dark shape. Here in the center, I'd like it to be lighter in value, so I'm using a thinner consistency, something maybe like tea or very thin milk. And I'm spacing the hairs apart, and that makes it look lighter. A thicker consistency, slightly thicker, like thin cream, will create a darker value. Use a thinner consistency, working inward, and I'm thinking about creating a smooth transition from the very dark to the not so dark. If you'd like to create a darker brown, add a tiny bit of ultramarine blue to the burnt umber. And I'll lay that up here where I'd like to see a darker brown. If you'd like to slightly smooth and unify and refine the color, you could apply a thin layer of yellow ochre. You can do this anytime during your painting. And do you see how it's changing the character of the color in addition to smoothing a little bit? And there it is, a small first study that you can use to hone your skills. And now we'll take a look at the Comer and Filbert brushes and how you can use them in your paintings. If you're finding this lesson helpful, I encourage you to like and subscribe because it helps others find our channel, and I appreciate it. You can also use something called a Comer brush or a Filbert grainer if you'd like to create fur more quickly. So I'm waking up. This is a Comer brush from Rosemary and Company. You want to fill both sides of the brush. This takes a bit of practice. You want to practice on a separate piece of watercolor paper. Anchor the hand to the table. I'm using the very tip of the brush. Sometimes you use just part of the brush, but you can create fur. Here I'm using only a couple bristles. You can create fur much more quickly when you're using a Comer brush. Now you see that looked a little sloppy because I need to do a warm-up before using my Comer brush, but you rinse your brush, wipe it on the towel. A Filbert grainer, you get a similar result with a Filbert grainer. So I'm waking up the brush, fill the brush on both sides. Now, this sometimes happens. You see, nothing came off the brush. I think it's because I need to dip my brush in water and make sure initially it's damp. Then I wipe it on the towel so it's barely damp, pick up a bit more color. And that's working. Okay, there we go. So you can get a similar result, really the same result as the other brush. So we've got some different choices for you there. As far as brushes go, that's a little sloppy right there. But you know what? If it's sloppy, it's okay because I typically apply more than one layer of fur. So the second layer can kind of cover up what I did there. The Comer and Filbert brushes are super helpful in applying fur quickly. I did a quick comparison just to see what the time difference is. I filled 3 shapes with fur, using a different brush for each shape, and timed each one. Here, we'll use the small brush. And that's how long it took to fill that much of the shape. Next, the Princeton Long Round number 6. This brush holds a little more paint, so it didn't take quite as long to fill the shape. And now for the Comer brush. And there's definitely a difference in the time that it takes. The smaller brush takes a little longer. The Comer takes less time, but really, I encourage you to use any brush that fits your needs. You might be wondering, when would you use the small and the medium and the Comer or the Filbert brushes in your paintings? I like to use the small brush in smaller areas and to create details. The medium-sized brush to fill slightly larger areas. And the Comer or the Filbert can be used when you want to fill large shapes with fur. In this example, I'm using the small brush, and then I'll switch to the Comer brush to get the color in more quickly. And you can use these brushes even when you have multiple layers of color in place, as we do here. Use a gentle touch, and the previous layers will stay in place. I'm using the medium-sized brush to do some smoothing. Dip the brush in water so it's slightly damp and use the side of the brush to gently smooth. Here's another example of how you can use the Comer brush to cover larger areas with thin layers of color. You can even use the comber or the filbert brush to smooth. The comber and the filbert brushes are useful if you'd like to create a fur-like edge that transitions into a darker background, using the slightly damp brush to lift color. And there it is, tips for painting fur, practice exercises, and some brushes that you can experiment with. And your challenge is to practice. Keep doing it over and over. Learn from mistakes. Use any paints, any brushes, any paper that you have on hand. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.